He arrived at 7 in the morning with a canvas bag and no small talk. Diana Ashworth opened the door and looked at him the way people look at someone who has come to fix something, a quick scan, a nod, and then the door swung wider. The Steinways stood in the parlor like a piece of furniture in mourning, dust along the lid, strings gone slack. Caleb Morrow lifted the fallboard and touched the keys once lightly, the way you check whether something is still warm. Then he stopped. He looked at nothing in particular and asked, very quietly, "Who played the Ravel?" Diana didn't answer. No one outside her mother knew that piece existed. She had hired him on a recommendation from the museum's instrument curator, a name passed along, with the assurance that he was careful with old things. That was all she needed. 2 weeks until the memorial, the piano unplayable, and no time to vet anyone more thoroughly. She had called the number, left a message, and he had called back within the hour, his voice low and unremarkable, asking only what model and what year. She told him. He said he could start Monday. She had not asked where he trained, whether he had a website, whether he was insured. He had a phone number and a reputation for being careful. That was the transaction, and Diana Ashworth preferred transactions she could control. When Monday came, he was punctual, which she respected, and quiet, which she appreciated. He worked in the parlor with the door open, and she worked at the dining table with her laptop, close enough to hear without watching. Every so often there was a sound, a wrench turning, a key struck once and then again, a soft exhale through his nose that might have meant satisfaction or concentration. She could not tell, and told herself it didn't matter. After 90 minutes, she walked to the doorway. "How long will it take?" He looked up without expression. "Depends what I find once I get inside the action. 3 days minimum, possibly 5. If the hammershanks need replacing. The memorial is in 12 days. That's enough time." She stood there another moment, waiting for something more reassurance, maybe, or the particular brand of cheerfulness that service workers sometimes offered. He offered nothing. He turned back to the piano. She returned to the dining table. The following morning he brought his son. Noah Morrow was 9 years old, and built like his father, lean, still, with the kind of watchfulness that usually belongs to much older people. He carried a book but didn't read it. He sat in the corner of the parlor on a low footstool and looked at the piano, the way some children look at aquariums, not at anything specific, just at the whole of it, as if waiting to understand what it contained. Diana noticed him from the hallway. She didn't ask. The boy was quiet and took up very little space, and she had learned early in life that the most efficient response to the presence of children was simply to work around them. At midday, she found the sheet music. Caleb had removed the top panel and set it against the wall, and in the process, something had come free from where it had been wedged between the panel and the frame, a single folded page, handwritten in pencil, the paper gone soft with age. She picked it up. "Pavane pour un infante de font." The notes were transcribed carefully, every dynamic marking included, the handwriting neither masculine nor feminine but precise and small. No name, no date. She held it for a long moment. The paper was delicate enough that she was afraid to unfold it further, so she just read what she could see, the title at the top. The first few bars. She didn't read music, but she recognized the piece. She had heard it, or something like it, humming through the old speakers of her mother's radio on Sunday mornings, and the memory arrived without warning and sat in her chest with unexpected weight. Caleb came back into the room, saw what she was holding, and looked at it without reaching for it. Something moved across his face, brief and unreadable. Not surprise, not recognition exactly, something more contained than either. Then he took a clean cloth from his bag and wiped his hands and said, "Where do you want me to set the panel?" "Against the far wall," she said. He moved past her. She put the sheet music on the piano bench and watched him work and said nothing else. She came home early on Wednesday because a meeting had ended ahead of schedule, and she heard the music before she reached the front door. It stopped her on the porch. One hand on the door handle, not turning it. The sound came through the old glass and old wood, with a clarity that had no business existing, every note landing exactly where it was meant to land. The rhythm neither rushed nor prolonged, just exact, the way certain things are exact when someone has learned them deeply enough that they no longer have to think about what comes next. She stood there long enough that the passage completed itself, long enough that she became aware of her own breathing. Then she opened the door. He heard her in the hallway and stopped. By the time she reached the parlor, He was sitting with his hands in his lap and the fallboard back down, and he looked at her with an expression that was not quite apology and not quite explanation, but something in between that she didn't have a word for. The room was very quiet. She thought of saying something and decided against it. "I'll be done with the action regulation by tomorrow," he said. "All right," she said. That was the entire conversation. She made dinner. She fed herself standing at the counter, looking at the closed parlor door, and then she sat down at her laptop and typed his name into a search bar, not because she had planned to, but because the sound of that playing was still somewhere in the room, and she needed to understand what she had heard. Caleb Morrow, piano soloist, Leeds International Piano Competition, first prize 2013, Carnegie Hall debut 2015. The review called him a pianist of uncommon stillness. Berlin Philharmonic engagement, 2021, cancelled. Reason listed as personal. She read that last line twice. She scrolled through archived concert programs and photographs. In one image, taken at a venue she didn't recognize, he stood at the edge of a stage in a dark suit, looking down at the keys with the same expression he wore when he was working, not distant, not focused, but present in some way that was difficult to name, not performing. Just there, with the music, like a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. The man in the photograph was the same man who had been in her parlor for 3 days, asking where she wanted the panel. She did not ask herself why he had chosen not to say. She understood, in a way she couldn't fully articulate, that there was a version of a life that required the erasure of its own previous chapter in order to continue. She had not lived that version, but she recognized its logic. She didn't call him. She didn't send a message. She went to her mother's closet instead, the boxes she hadn't opened since the funeral, and she went through them slowly, not sure what she was looking for. Near the bottom of the third box, she found an envelope of old ticket stubs. Eleanor had kept them for reasons Diana had never understood. She went through them one by one. Theater, symphony, a few films. Near the back, a concert stub, March 2019, Burlington. The performer's name had been torn away, not lost, torn, cleanly, from the top of the stub. Diana set it on the nightstand and looked at it for a long time. Outside, the maple at the edge of the yard moved in the dark. She stopped pretending she was working in the dining room. The next morning she brought her coffee to the parlor and sat in the armchair near the window with a folder of documents she didn't read. He arrived at 8, said good morning, and began work without commenting on the change. She found that she liked this about him, that he registered things without requiring them to be explained. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while. "Sure. This piano. Do you know its history?" He was inside the case, adjusting something. "Steinway Model B, 1967. Serial number puts it in the New York factory. Good instrument, probably belonged to someone who played professionally, based on the action wear." He paused. "Or someone who played very seriously as an amateur for a very long time. My mother bought it in 1998, Diana said. From an estate sale. She told me it had belonged to a professor in Boston. That's consistent. She didn't play." He came out from behind the case and looked at her, just briefly. "The keys say otherwise." The room went quiet. Diana looked at the keyboard. "The wear pattern on the upper register especially," he said, not pressing it. "Someone put in a lot of hours." She thought of her mother at 71, stooped over a garden bed, hands that could coax anything from soil. She had never once seen those hands on a piano. She had never thought to ask about it. There were things you didn't think to ask until there was no one left to answer. Gerald Voss arrived at 11:30 with a bottle of wine and what he called a neighborly check-in. He was 62 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of ease that came from decades of never being told no. He had known her father since before Diana was born, and he wore that history like a garment he expected others to recognize and make room for. He stood in the parlor doorway and looked at Caleb with an expression that wasn't quite displeasure but was close. "Making progress?" he said. "Yes," Caleb said, and went back to work. Voss waited until Caleb had gone to his truck for a replacement part, and then he set the wine on the side table and said, casually, "Diana, I've been thinking, a piano this age, it might be better served in the hands of someone with the resources to restore it properly. I know a collector in Connecticut who would give it a real home." "It has a home," she said. "Of course." He smiled. "Just something to consider." He stayed for 20 minutes. He asked about the memorial plans, about the museum's upcoming exhibition, about whether Diana had thought about the board vacancy her mother had left. He was good at conversations that accomplished things without appearing to. Diana had grown up watching men like him, and she knew how to wait them out. After he left, Noah came in from the hallway where he had been sitting on the stairs. He looked at Diana with a directness that was startling in a child his age. "Do you play?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Later, when Caleb was reassembling the lower panel, he found the crack. It was along the inner wall of the case, near the bottom, not structural damage, not something time or climate had done. The wood around it showed old tool marks. Someone had made an opening there deliberately and sealed it back up. And over the years the seal had failed and the seam had opened again. He ran his finger along it and said nothing. Diana drove out to the east side of town on a Thursday afternoon, the sheet music folded in her coat pocket. Ruth Calloway lived in a white house at the end of a gravel road, with a garden that was going to seed in the October cold, and a front porch that held 2 chairs, and an old coffee can full of dried lavender. Ruth opened the door before Diana knocked. She was 65 and had known Eleanor Ashworth for 40 years, and she had the kind of face that showed its history without apology. There were people who aged into softness and people who aged into clarity, and Ruth was the second kind. Diana took the sheet music from her pocket and held it out. Ruth looked at it. Something happened in her expression, a small, involuntary thing. There and gone. She didn't take the paper. "Come in," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." They sat in the kitchen. Ruth made tea and didn't rush the process, and Diana waited. The kitchen smelled like dried herbs and old wood, and a cat Diana hadn't known Ruth had sat on the windowsill and ignored them both. "Did my mother play piano?" Diana asked. Ruth poured carefully. "How are you doing, sweetheart? It's been 6 months now." "Ruth." "I know. Did she know someone named Caleb Morrow?" Ruth set the kettle down and was quiet for a moment. "Your mother had parts of her life that she kept for herself," she said finally. "That's not the same as hiding." "What parts?" "Before your father. Before this town." Ruth folded her hands around her cup. She was someone else for a while, in another city. She had a life there that didn't travel with her. Music was part of it. "What does that mean?" "It means she was young, and she was good at things she never told you about." Ruth looked out the window at the bare garden. "And that's not a failing on either of your parts. That's just how time works." Diana pressed further. Ruth gave a little, and then stopped giving, the way people do when they have promised silence to someone who is no longer here to release them from it. The promise was still a promise. Diana understood this, even through the frustration of it. Diana drove home with more questions than she'd brought. The road back into town was shadowed by elms that had lost most of their leaves, and the light was low and gray, and she drove slowly. She stood in front of the piano that evening, the room dim, the heat ticking softly in the walls. She laid her palms flat on the closed lid. The lacquer was cool and a little rough at the edges from age. She stood there long enough that her eyes adjusted to the dark. She didn't open it. She didn't know what she would have done if she had. At 9 o'clock, her phone lit up with a message from Caleb: technical update. Pedal mechanism done. Tuning next. She wrote back, "Good." Then she looked at the message for a moment, and before she could talk herself out of it, she typed, "Do you remember the first time you heard the ravel?" She put the phone on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. She was asleep before he answered. The appraisal documents arrived at the museum in a large envelope with Gerald Voss's law firm's return address. Diana opened them at her desk on Friday morning and found a formal offer letter, a provenance summary for the piano, and a 6-page valuation that put the instrument at significantly more than she had imagined. The number was not what stopped her. It was the collector's letter, clipped to the back 3 paragraphs of effusive praise for the instrument's history, and a sentence near the end. "Per our discussion with the Heritage Council, we understand the family may be amenable to a transfer arrangement given the terms of the 2003 endowment agreement." She read that sentence twice. Then she read it a third time. She walked to the museum's archive room and spent an hour going through the endowment files for the Voss family's 20-year gift history. She didn't find what she was looking for that day, but she found enough threads to know something was there. She found the 2003 agreement itself, 17 pages, dense and dry, with subsections that required careful reading. She marked the pages she'd need to return to and put it all in a folder and brought it home. She would read the rest that evening, after dinner, with a cup of coffee and the kind of attention she usually reserved for contracts she was about to sign. That afternoon, Caleb finished the main repair work. He tested the piano for 40-minute scales, arpeggios, long passages Diana didn't recognize, and then he sat back and said, "She's done. The regulation is set. Tuning will need to settle for a day or two, but she's playable." Diana came in from the hallway. "Will you play something?" He looked at her. "Not for any reason," she said. I'd like to hear what it sounds like when it's right." He sat at the bench, and she sat on the settee near the window, and he played the gymnopédie. The first one, Sadie, slow and deliberate and somehow both lonely and peaceful at the same time. Diana sat with her hands in her lap and did not move. She had not allowed herself to feel anything she couldn't name in 6 months. This feeling had no name. She looked at him while he played his profile, his hands, the slight forward tilt of his head, and she let it happen anyway. When he finished, the last note lingered longer than it should have in the old room. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Noah came in from the hallway, holding something carefully between 2 hands. He crossed the room and held it out to Diana. It was a photograph. Black and white, slightly bent at one corner. A young woman sitting at a piano, her back half turned to the camera, her face in 3/4 profile, the angle of her chin, the way her right shoulder sat. Diana knew her immediately. She turned the photograph over. The handwriting on the back was small and slanted. Burlington, 1989. For the music, and for what comes after. No signature. She sat there holding it, and the room was very quiet, and Caleb watched her face and said nothing. Diana went back to Ruth's house on Saturday morning. She didn't call ahead. She drove the 20 minutes in silence, and knocked on the door, and when Ruth opened it, Diana held up the photograph without saying a word. Ruth looked at it for a long time. Then she stepped back from the door. They sat at the same kitchen table. This time Ruth didn't make tea. "She taught piano," Ruth said, "before she met your father, before any of this." Diana waited. Burlington. She had a studio in her apartment, just a small upright, but she had 7 or 8 students. This was 1988, 89, 90. She was very good, better than she ever let on to any of us here. "And Caleb Morrow?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "One of her students. He was 10 when he started with her. She taught him for 3 years. Ruth looked at the photograph, which was still lying on the table between them. She used to talk about him, back then, said she'd never taught anyone who heard music the way he did. That he didn't just learn notes, he understood what the notes were trying to say. A pause. She gave him that Ravel piece, said it wasn't in any curriculum. She just heard him play one day, and knew that was the piece he needed. Diana's throat was dry. "She went to Burlington in March of 2019, Ruth said. "She didn't tell anyone why. She went alone and came back the next day, and she didn't say much about it, but I could see it in her. Something had happened. Something good." Ruth's hands tightened together on the table. She had seen him perform. She knew who he'd become. "She said to me, a few weeks later, she said, 'Ruth, I think I might have done one thing right that I never got credit for.'" She didn't explain. "I didn't push." Diana put her hand flat on the table. "And when he moved to Ashford?" she asked. She knew who he was. She saw his name on the permit when he opened his workshop. Ruth exhaled slowly. "The museum referral, that was her. She called in a favor from your curator about a month before she got sick. Said the piano needed work, and she knew the right person for it." Ruth looked at her directly now. "She arranged it. She wanted him to come here. She just didn't live long enough to see it." Diana sat in the car for a long time afterward. She didn't start the engine. The street was quiet. A few leaves moved across the pavement in front of her. She watched them and felt something vast and strange settling in her chest, the way water settles after a stone. When she got home, Caleb was still there, finishing a few last adjustments to the pedal hardware, checking the tuning one final time. He was sitting at the bench with the lid open, not playing, just listening to the vibration after a test chord died away. She stood in the doorway. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, he read something in her face and set the tuning fork on the bench and gave her his full attention. She stood there for a long moment, looking at him. Then she walked into the room. "My mother knew you," Diana said. She said it quietly, sitting across from him in the chair nearest the piano, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She had not rehearsed how to begin this. She began the only way she knew how, which was at the beginning. Caleb listened without moving. She told him what Ruth had told her, not quickly, not in the way of someone delivering information, but slowly, piece by piece, the way you hand someone something fragile. Burlington, 1988. A boy of 10. 3 years of lessons. The ravel, given without explanation because something was heard in the playing that needed that particular answer. She told him about the 2019 concert, the torn ticket stub. The thing Ruth had said, "I think I might have done one thing right that I never got credit for." When she finished, he sat for a long moment without speaking. His hands rested on his knees. He looked at the keys. "I don't remember her name," he said finally. "I was 10. I called her Miss Eleanor. That's all I had. She moved away one summer, and I started with another teacher the following fall. And He stopped. "I never forgot the ravel, but I lost the name. She kept yours." He looked at her then. "She kept your name," Diana said. "For 30 years. The silence lasted long enough that the house settled once around them. "She taught me that music didn't need to be witnessed to matter," he said. "I forgot that for a few years. After Claire." He paused. "My wife. She died in the winter of 2020. I stopped playing. I moved here because I needed somewhere that had no expectation of me." He looked at his hands. "I don't know why I chose Ashford specifically. I've never been able to explain it to myself." Diana thought of the permit. The timing. Her mother with a phone in her hand, calling in a quiet favor. She thought about what it meant to arrange something you wouldn't live to see. They were still sitting there when Voss arrived. He came without calling, which told Diana everything she needed to know about how he had decided to proceed. He had a man with him she recognized as a junior partner from the Heritage Council's law firm, and he carried a folder the way people carry things when they want you to feel outpaced. "Diana," he said, with a warmth she no longer believed. "I'm sorry to drop by. We've had some movement on the collection matter, and I thought it better to discuss in person." The folder held a copy of an endowment agreement her father had signed in 2003, 17 pages, dense with language about the council's advisory role in managing donated cultural assets. Clause 9, subsection 4, gave the council right of first consultation on any instrument of appraised value above a threshold that the piano now exceeded. "This is a standard protection," Voss said. "No one is forcing anything." "The clause expires," Diana said. He paused. Section 12. The advisory rights sunset after 20 years, if not renewed by mutual agreement. That's October of this year. She set the document on the coffee table between them. "The piano stays." The lawyer said something quietly to Voss. Voss looked at Diana with an expression she had never seen on him before, something between recalibration and the beginnings of respect. Caleb had not moved from his chair near the piano. He hadn't spoken, but he was there, and Voss glanced at him once, and then looked back at Diana, and the air in the room had a different weight. Voss left without the answer he came for. The memorial was held on a Tuesday evening in October. The museum's main gallery had been cleared of its usual arrangement, and the Steinway stood at the center of the room beneath the overhead lights, the lacquer catching the glow. Seasonal flowers on 2 pedestals, 40 or so chairs arranged in loose rows. Diana had not printed a program. She had not listed a performer. She had said, to those who asked, that there would be live music, and she had said it in a tone that made further questions feel unnecessary. The guests arrived in the way that people arrive at memorial events, slowly, in pairs, speaking in the subdued register of shared loss. Gerald Voss came with 3 members of the Heritage Council. Ruth Calloway came alone and took a chair at the far end of the second row. Caleb came in through the side entrance with Noah, and found a seat for his son near the back. Then he walked to the piano. No one introduced him. He sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and looked across the room at Diana, who was standing near the far wall. She met his eyes. She nodded, once, small. He opened the fallboard. He played the pavane. The first 2 bars were all it took. The room changed. It was not a dramatic change. No one gasped. No one turned, but something in the collective posture of the space shifted, like a field when wind moves through it. People who had been half looking at their programs looked up. People who had been whispering to neighbors went still. Ruth Calloway stood at the side of the gallery with her hands clasped in front of her. Halfway through the piece she began to cry. She didn't hide it. The tears ran down her face and she didn't move to wipe them, and a few people near her noticed, and then looked at Diana, and then looked at the man at the piano, and understood nothing concretely but felt everything correctly. Gerald Voss, who had positioned himself near the exit with the intention of leaving after a polite interval, sat down. He did it in the middle of a passage, without grace, like a man whose legs had decided before his mind did. He sat, and he listened. Diana stood against the wall and watched Caleb's hands. Her arms were at her sides. She was not going to cry. She had decided this, and she did not, but she felt, for the first time since January, that her mother was not absent, that she was somewhere in the room, distributed through the air the way sound is, present in every molecule the music reached. When the last note released, the silence was absolute for a full 3 seconds. Then it dissolved slowly into the ordinary sounds of a room, returning to itself. Afterward, when most of the guests had gathered near the refreshment table and the chairs had been moved back, Diana found an empty seat on the bench along the wall near the piano. She sat and breathed. The room buzzed softly around her. Noah came and sat beside her. He said nothing. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the middle distance, and Diana looked down at him, and then she saw what he was holding, the handwritten sheet music, folded carefully into quarters, held between his palms like something that needed protecting. She didn't ask him how he had it. She sat with him in the quiet, and the gallery carried on around them. By the following week, the town had figured out who had played. It happened the way things happen in small places, not all at once, but in increments. Someone had Googled the name from the side entrance sign-in sheet. Someone else had recognized the concert program archived on an old arts website. By Wednesday, the woman who ran the local paper had called Diana's office. Diana said that Mr. Morrow was a private individual who had come as a guest, and that she had no further comment, and the woman accepted this because Diana's family had been connected to that paper for 3 generations. Gerald Voss came to the museum on Thursday. He came alone this time. No lawyer, no folder. He sat across from Diana in her office and looked tired in a way she hadn't seen in him before. "I'm withdrawing the proposal," he said. "The collector has been informed." She waited. "I've been chair of this council for 19 years, he said. "I've made a lot of decisions I thought were in the interest of preservation. Some of them were." He looked at his hands briefly. "I heard that piece Tuesday night, and I thought about Eleanor, about what she would have said about a room full of people deciding what to do with something that wasn't really theirs to decide about." He stood up and said he'd have the formal withdrawal in writing by Friday. Diana walked him to the door and watched him go, and felt something uncomplicated for the first time in weeks. She found Caleb outside. He was on the museum's side terrace, which overlooked a maple that had gone entirely gold in the October cold. Noah was inside, and it was just the two of them in the dark, the leaves on the stone path below catching the light from the windows. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You don't owe me anything for that." "I know. I'm saying it anyway." A moment went by. "She never knew I came back to playing," he said. "After Claire died, I stopped for almost 2 years. I started again, slowly, in the year before I moved here. Small things, at home, alone." He looked at the tree. "She never knew, but she taught me the thing that let me start again. She taught me that the playing doesn't have to be witnessed to be real." He paused. "I've never been able to explain to myself why I chose Ashford. Of all the small towns in Vermont, I packed my truck and came here. I don't know why." Diana looked at the dark maple. "I might know why," she said. She didn't say more than that. He didn't ask. They stood close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm, and neither of them moved, and neither of them moved away. The door opened and Noah came out, scarf in hand. "Dad, ready?" Caleb looked at Diana. Noah looked at Diana too. "The piano will need checking," Diana said. "In a few weeks, after the tuning settles completely." Noah looked at his father with an expression that was too knowing for 9. "Okay," Caleb said. He put his hand briefly on Noah's shoulder, and they walked toward the parking lot, and Diana stood on the terrace and watched the maple until the car had gone. He came back on a Thursday morning in early November, and when Diana opened the door he saw immediately that she had placed a printed edition of the Pavane on the music stand above the keyboard. The handwritten original was framed on the wall beside it. She kept her copy, Diana said. I thought she should have it back. He sat at the bench, and she sat beside him, their arms nearly touching, and he showed her where middle C was and told her to find it without looking. She found it on the second try. He spent an hour with her on the first 4 bars, the interval between the first 2 notes, the way the thumb had to stay loose. She was not naturally gifted, and she didn't pretend otherwise, and he didn't praise her when she got it right, because he could tell she didn't want that. He just said, again, and waited. At one point, Noah, who had settled on the footstool with his book, looked up and said, Your wrist is too stiff. Drop it a little. Diana looked at the boy. He taught me, Noah said, returning to his book. She dropped her wrist and played the interval again. It sounded different, rounder, less struck, better, Caleb said. He left at noon. She practiced alone for 20 minutes after, stumbling through the bars until the notes were in her fingers rather than her head. She came back that evening. The house was settling into the night around her, radiators ticking, the last light dying outside. She opened the score, put her hands on the keys, and counted herself in. The first bars came out slower than they should have been. Her timing was off. The intervals were right, but the weight behind them was wrong, too even, too careful. She played through the errors without stopping, the way he had told her to, and somewhere in the second page, something shifted. Not in her hands. In what she understood the music was for. She thought about her mother in Burlington, alone in the 3rd row, a woman who had built an entire life somewhere far from the things she had once loved, watching a man she had taught at 10 years old fill an auditorium with a sound that had passed through her hands first. She didn't realize she was crying until she felt it on her palms. Not grief, not the flat, heavy kind, the kind of feeling that comes from understanding something you had always carried without words, and finally having the words, and finding that they fit. She played the page to its end. Then she sat in the quiet. A knock at the door. She got up and walked down the hallway and opened it, and Caleb stood on the porch with the look of a man who had forgotten something small. Torque screwdriver, he said. Left it on the bench. The light from inside spilled out around her. The smell of November came in cold air, dry leaves, distant wood smoke. She stepped to one side. He came in. The piano stood in the parlor with its fallboard open, the score on the stand, the framed page on the wall. The lamp made the room amber. For the first time since Eleanor Ashworth had brought that instrument home, the house did not feel like it was waiting for something to end.